Ladies and gentlemen, get the book Dr. Joshua Bowen wrote, The Atheist Handbook to the Old Testament. It is extremely full of knowledge and information for anyone, as well as join the Patreon. There's hundreds of videos that have been not released to the internet. You can ask questions and I will record them with these scholars in high definition. I do that all the time. You can also personal message me and you help the community grow. Thanks a lot. Dr. Joshua Bowen, in your experience, do evangelical scholars hold positions due to theological commitments rather than an honest examination of historical evidence? Now, I know that this is not a yes or no question. Right. This is obviously complex and nuanced. And I'm sure that this is a yes and no question.
Yeah.
So, can you take us into your experience in the field as a scholar and your experience as a person who probably did have these, I guess you could say, theological commitments that limited you, and then now the light switch kind of went off and you're like, okay, I can actually explore whatever now and I don't have to worry. But can you take us into this?
Yeah, and you're absolutely right. It's a complicated question because it's not just a matter of certain evangelical scholars do it and certain don't. Or certain atheistic scholars do and some don't. It's a matter of this particular scholar on this topic will do it. But on these other topics, everything seems to be totally above board and really high quality scholarship. So I don't want to mention anybody's names, obviously, but there are certain topics, in my experience, that sort of lend themselves to drawing certain evangelical scholars to hold to commitments seemingly at the expense of what the data appears to say. The Exodus is one of them. The dating of the book of Daniel is one. The authorship of the Pentateuch is one. And I'll take those in reverse order. So, if you read through my book, there's a chapter on did Moses write the Pentateuch? The answer is no. I'm sorry. The answer is no. And that's not my opinion. It is my opinion. It is my opinion. Sorry about hitting my mic there. That was for emphasis.
No.
But this is just consensus scholarship, right? Has been for, I think Joel Baden said, for 100 years. I think that was his quote, for 100 years. Probably more.
Even rabbis noticed this 300 years ago. So let's stop playing games.
Yeah.
Even the most orthodox rabbis started going, okay, hold on, he didn't write about his own death. So at least they started budging on details. And then that's when things started to fall in order, but
But it's interesting to look, because some of these topics, even evangelical scholars, there seems to be uniformity across the board, right? Even though you would think that it really does damage to their position. So for example, slavery, as I mentioned in another video, like slavery in the Hebrew Bible, there's just uniformity. Everybody from evangelical scholars to liberal scholars, whatever that means, will all say, there's debt and chattel slavery in the Hebrew Bible that's endorsed. Done. Of course. Some will nuance it a little bit and some will play, but for the most part, that's just how it is. There's uniformity. Things like the Ezekiel prophecy, across the board, biblical scholars will say, yes, Nebuchadnezzar was supposed to take Tyre in Ezekiel 26 and he didn't. Done. He says it in 29, right? That's just across the board. Their beef is not with whether Nebuchadnezzar was supposed to do it or like some later, many nations, whatever. What they do is they have a theological interpretation, right, that addresses that. And we can talk about that maybe in another video.
Yeah.
So on certain issues, you really don't have this theological commitment that seems to hamper what I consider to be like sound interpretation of the text. But there are certain things that sometimes surprisingly will. So for example, I talk about in the book some of the, what I believe are contradictions that show up, for example, in the primeval history in Genesis 1 through 11. And the lengths that certain evangelical scholars will go to reconcile them. Even what I consider to be to weird lengths. In the creation story of Genesis 2, one of the things that Joel Baden points out in his book, and other scholars have pointed out, I think Joel just points it out really well, is he points these contradictions out, I think, very clearly. And one of them is the sequence of things, the sequence of events between the two creation accounts. And animals are created in Genesis 1 first, and then humanity is created after them, right? Mm-hmm. And humanity is created together after them. In Genesis 2, you have the animals created. You have humanity created. Adam, gosh, I need some sleep.
It's okay.
You have Adam created, and then there's a reason then that the animals are created. They're to be a helper for him, like this partner for him. So God creates the animals and then brings them all before him. So the text says he creates all the animals and he brings them before Adam, and Adam names them all, but there's no helper suitable for him. So he creates Eve. So you notice humans are not created at the same time, they're created separately, and the animals are created after Adam. Well, it's a clear problem, right? And everybody recognizes that it's a problem. But the lengths that some evangelical scholars will go to reconcile that. For example, one of the things, and I put it in the book, is there's this sort of apologetic response that says, well, because they want it to be one narrative straight through, not two different creation stories from two different sources, right? They want it to be one source, not even a source. It's just Moses wrote the thing, right?
Yeah.
Or a single author, and then maybe some editing was done later, whatever. So what they'll do is they'll say, this particular scholar that I'm thinking of said, well, God must have created the animals in Genesis 1, but then created special animals for the garden in Genesis 2.
Of course. Oh, this is the same stuff I see in Apologist and the Gospels and all that in the New Testament. It's the same stuff.
It's like, well, so the question is that possible? I mean, sure. Does that make a lot of sense? No, of course not. And another example, and again, this is sort of like the flagship example that Joel Baden has in his book. And I love Joel. You hear me reference him a lot. He's a brilliant scholar. Is Genesis 37 with the Joseph story. And of course, he points out he goes through a history of interpretation of Genesis 37. And of course, the problem for those that are listening that don't know what the problem is, how does Joseph get down to Egypt? Right? Did the Ishmaelites take him? Did the Midianites take him? Did the brothers sell him? Did the Midianites sell him? Who pulls him up out of the pit?
One of them says he's going to be killed.
Yeah.
Yeah.
How does it happen? Well, if you read through the text, read through the canonical, the final form, you're going to throw your hands up going,
If you pay careful attention,
yes,
you're going to throw your hands up. I never paid careful attention.
Oh, yeah, of course. That's exactly right. So in one verse, it talks about how, the brothers are going to sell them to the Ishmaelites. Another verse talks about the Midianites pull them up out of the pit and sell them to the Ishmaelites. Then there's a later verse that talks about in chapter 39, says the Midianites brought them down to Egypt and sold them. It's like, so does that prove a contradiction? Can you prove a contradiction? No, because somebody could, and people have said, Well, the brothers pulled him out, sold him to the Midianites, who sold him to the Ishmaelites, who took him down to Egypt and sold him back to the Midianites, who sold him to Potiphar.
Oh, yeah. Jeez. I mean, the level.
I mean, okay. You feel good about that? Like, because I don't feel good about that.
Or they'll do the strain by jumping to a whole nother text to say, well, there's this place where the Midianites, or it's the Ishmaelites, I think.
Yeah.
They mean these people, or they mean the Midianites.
That's
or something.
Right. It's in Judges 8, I think, is where it's at.
Yeah, they jump and they go, well, they're the same people.
Yeah, and we deal with that I deal with that in the book. But the point is, I think that the why, right? There's a book that just came out on the Exodus, an edited volume, a couple years ago. And I was looking through one of the chapters, because it just came yesterday. And in the conclusion, it said, essentially, so we need to revisit, and it's somebody that I know, it's somebody that I really respect. I like him a lot. His scholarship is fantastic. But I feel like sometimes when it kind of moves into certain areas that are kind of touchy like this, that the scholarship, it gets pulled on by these commitments. And it basically says something akin to, it starts with the biblical account and then is trying to find a way to possibly account for it, to allow for it. And so it says, so we can't necessarily write this out. Well, again, we can't necessarily say there's a contradiction in Genesis 37, but we probably should, right? And sort of the big example that pops to my mind, Tremper Longman III, in his commentary on Daniel, wrote essentially in the introduction that, and he said several times throughout the book, the evidence is with a late date in the book of Daniel, 2nd century date. And I mean, people like Chon Leung Seau, or John Goldingay, or a lot of these Christian scholars will say, evangelical scholars, 2nd century date, of course. But Tremper Longman says, because of my theological conclusions, my positions, because I don't think that it's untenable that it was written in the 6th century, I hold to a 6th century position. But then he says, but I don't think anybody should be judging anybody's Christianity based on whether they date it late or not. So
then why doesn't he just hold to the late date and say, I'm a Christian who holds the late date?
Because he has a theological interpretation of the text.
Right.
I don't think that he would think it won't make me a Christian, but it is his theological conclusion. But this is the issue. It's, where do you start? Right? A good friend of mine, I always talk about this, a good friend of mine, Stephen Anderson, not that Stephen Anderson. I went to seminary with him. He went down to Dallas. Again, good friend of mine.
But I remember that Stephen Anderson, though. He pisseth against the wall.
Yes. But he wrote his dissertation on Cyaxares II on the book of Daniel, and arguing for an early date of the book of Daniel. And in one of the footnotes, I think in either the first or second chapters, he basically says, and I quote it in the book, but he basically says, Daniel is not just another source to be utilized to reconstruct the history of the period. It is the source against which all other sources must be measured, because it is the divinely inspired, inerrant Word of God.
So what we talked about earlier, all of the Akkadian, or whatever, in terms of this, I think this is Babylonian. So all Babylonian sources are secondary completely, no matter how you want to paint the picture. Oh, well, this is just a simple, they went out and they traded the 50 horses and that was it. Like, all of that with no theological baggage attached, it appears, all that's nothing. It's useless in comparison to the Daniel book.
Yeah, it has to be. Now, I think that's an extreme example, but maybe not that extreme.
I think he sees it, though. I think the fact that he makes that statement tells me he sees the problem which is why he needs to say,
Oh, yeah.
Bible first. And that is where you said, where do you start? So if your presupposition's Bible first, of course, this is the thing I think is the problem is they want, and you know what the accusation comes? And I say they, not as in your friend.
Sure.
I'm saying in general what I deal with. They go and accuse, you don't treat the Bible the same way you treat the ancient Near East. No.
You don't treat the Bible.
Exactly. You are accusing us of the very thing you aren't doing.
Yeah.
And yes, I talk about the Bible. That's what my show's about.
Yeah.
What do you want me to do? Why don't you pick on the Buddhist, Eric? I never read a text about Buddha. Like, I know this much about Buddha.
And the Buddhists, I don't
just
know of a
making-
lot of Buddhists that are trying to, like, you know, implement laws that restrict people's rights in the United
Or even
States.
Islam. Why do you pick on Christianity? They go, why don't you pick on Judaism? Why don't you pick on this? And I'm like, have you not watched my Old Testament stuff? And don't worry, Islam's coming, okay? So it's just, I haven't learned enough about it. But I could tell you what, I'm going to treat them all equally.
Yes, of course.
You know, and that doesn't mean I knock everyone who believes these. This means if you're offended, you're probably the guy you're probably the guy who's doing the very thing I'm critiquing.
Yeah.
I don't go attack Anglicans from the Church of England. They don't attack me. I'm friends with Jonathan Sheffield. Jonathan Sheffield takes an early date. You know?
Friends with my wife,
Yeah.
who is an Anglican.
Sorry, I got a little loud. Your kids are sleeping. So
No, that's good.
yeah, I just had to voice that.
Yeah,
to say.
I agree. And, you know, I think maybe to sort of tie this together, because the original question was, like, are the theological commitments? And I think the big thing is if we're beginning with the text as the inspired and inerrant Word of God, there aren't a lot of ways to go. And as a very brief example, I've talked about this before, but the king Naram Sin, the old Akkadian grandson of Sargon of Akkad, he deified himself, right? And there's a lot of textual evidence about that. Administrative texts that aren't propagandistic in and of themselves, but they show up with his name with that divine determinative, that divine symbol, the star symbol, showing him to be a god. So we have lots of contemporary textual evidence. Lots. We have a statue, like a stele that has him standing much bigger than everybody else, wearing a horned headdress, which is a symbol of a god. And the texts all talk about how the gods made him divine. Now, if we began with the presumption that that's an inspired set of documents, inspired by God, then we're going to look for possibilities that, well, is it possible that Naram Sin was actually deified? Well, I mean, like, we weren't there. You know, maybe it is that the gods did come down and grant him special immortality. Like, we don't have any. I mean, look at all the evidence we have that's positive for here. Look at all these administrative texts that start showing up with his name as a god, and we have the memory went down for hundreds of years later in literary texts. Mm-hmm. I feel like we've got really strong evidence if we start with the conclusion that he was made divine. Mm-hmm. But we don't, because we recognize this for what it was. We recognize it for propaganda.
And Christians would agree with you.
Yeah,
all day.
100%.
It's when you get to their book, or their way of viewing the book.
And so, as you said, I think the key point is to treat the Bible, at least initially, like another ancient Near Eastern text, and submit it to the same rigorous critical analysis. And say, okay, now once we've done that, let's take a step back and say, what interpretive model makes the most sense? Mm-hmm. Is it the one where we have this fallible document that doesn't have historical, and it's got lots of historical problems in it, even though it's no more than any other ancient document, but it has historical problems in it, it has moral problems in it, ethical problems. It's not consistent, it has different voices. is it more likely or less likely that this is divinely inspired? Or is it more likely that this is another ancient Near Eastern text that is representative of a group of people, probably, I mean, almost certainly elites, that are engaging with the divine at best, right? And trying to engage with them in such a way that, reflects their beliefs and traditions.
Well said. Thank you.
Of course.